I have a love-hate relationship with the 5 love languages. Mostly love. I'm coming around. But this is actually the first time I've ever done a teaching specifically about the 5 love languages. And I've always resisted it, even though everybody else in my life seems to be head over heels about this love languages book. I got a couple of issues with it, and it says it in the introduction of the book that it's not a comprehensive list by any means, but I think there's other love languages that are a little more, parsed out or specific. I think my wife has another love language that is probably her first love language, with me anyway. And somebody once told me that it's really acts of service, but I'm like, it's not really acts of service. Like, she doesn't need me to make her breakfast. What she needs is for me to get organized. And so I call that love language get your act together. I actually call it gist, but I can't say that word in the church, G-Y-S-T. Okay, anyway, the book's claim is that you fill each other's tanks by loving one another with their love language. By loving your spouse with their love language, you fill their tank, right? And so everybody kind of goes at marriage from that vantage point. I've heard preachers talk about it like a bank. One preacher talked about having a love bank, which I chuckle at sometimes, but I'm a teenage boy still. But like a love bank, and you gotta have deposits, you gotta have withdrawals. Like you gotta keep a healthy balance in your love bank, right? Chuckle, chuckle, chuckle. So like that kind of thing is how we usually go at this marriage. But there's a couple issues I have with that. First of all, is that when your tank is empty, it's implicitly your spouse's fault. And I don't believe that to be true. And I'm going to talk about why a little bit later. When your tank is empty, according to this model, it's your spouse's fault for not loving you the way you need to be loved. And then what happens, and this isn't so much about the book as us, when our tank is empty because our spouse didn't fill our tank, what happens in the love language way is you start, this is like a universal truth. I see this in counseling so much. When your tank is empty, when your needs aren't being met, you will start to love your spouse with your own love language. So my love language is words of affirmation. My wife's love language is acts of service or gist. All she wants me to do is keep a calendar. That's all I got to do to make her the happiest woman in the world. Keep a calendar and stick to it. And yet, if my tank is empty, my instinct will be to give her words of affirmation. Because what am I doing? I'm baiting. I'm trying to get her to mirror because I'm starving here. You know, that kind of thing? And so that is the recipe for just disaster, like deficit spending in your love bank. That is bankruptcy in the making. And it's also, I think, a path to resentment, a two-sided resentment, because I'm giving her all these words of affirmation and it just does nothing for her. She doesn't care what I have to say about her, That's not her love language. And I'm like, you look pretty today, those shoes are nice, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and she's like, just keep a calendar. In Ephesians 5, Paul kind of gives some instructions for marriage. First of all, he says to submit to each other, mutual submission, which everybody that's ever been in church has only heard that wives are supposed to submit to husbands. That's mostly because it's usually men that are talking in church. So we skip that verse right before it, where it says, submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. Then it does say, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. This is verse 22 of Ephesians 5. And then later in verse 25, it says, husbands, love your wives. At other points in other letters, Paul says, husbands ought to love their wives, or husbands must love their wives. Does that sound like a feeling? That's an obligation. It's a choice. It's an ought. Love your wives as Jesus loved the church. And what? Does anybody know this? Love the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy. So the role of a husband, so it says the role of a wife is to submit, and then the role of a husband is to love. And the old joke goes that the man and his wife are in counseling with the preacher, and the woman says, preacher, he just won't love me, he doesn't love me. And the husband pulls out his Bible and says, right here it says, wives, submit to your husbands, and husbands, love your wives. If she'll submit, then I'll love her. Like it's a chronological thing. That's not really how it works, because to love someone is to submit beyond submission itself. It is the greatest act of submission. To love in the way of Jesus is to give away all your power. And even though Jesus was God, he gave up his power and took up a cross and became a criminal on a cross, so we would know he loves us. There's no greater submission than that. And so that's the love that a husband, I actually think that's the love that husbands and wives are to have for each other, that kind of submissive love that surrenders itself. Can I tell you the real reason I struggle with the love languages? And I alluded to it earlier when I said the part about it's the exchange. It's the idea that your marriage is an economy between the two of you and that it's a give and take, which I know is a very common sense way of thinking about marriage, but I have another word for common sense, and that is godless and kind of secular. It is a graceless way of thinking about marriage. That way of thinking about marriage says, if my wife goes through a season where she's unable to give me what I need and I run a deficit economy, I deserve better. And if she doesn't fill my tank or my account or whatever analogy you're using, then I don't have anything to give her. And it's her fault. And that, if you don't even have to say that out loud. If you think that way, man, that can lead some dark, dark places pretty quick. And I think the gospel leads us to think about marriage differently. And that is this. Instead of you take from her and then you give back to her and you both keep each other's accounts balanced and it's this, perfect give and take. I think the more you can think about marriage as a relationship where you and your spouse are not dependent on each other, but you're both equally and totally dependent on Jesus together. The goal here is that you get your sustenance, your cup is filled not by your spouse or anyone else, but your Father in heaven. That God is the source of your joy. God is the source of your identity. God is the one you go to for quality time first and for words of affirmation. God gives you these things first, and you get all the love you need from him. And whatever your spouse gives you, man, that's just icing on the cake. That's just filled to overflowing. That's just over and abundant in joy. But what your spouse has to give you isn't what you run on. What God gives you is what you run on, so that when your spouse has nothing to give you, when they go through a season of joblessness or when they're sick or depressed, as people are all the time, and they can't fill your tank, it doesn't mean you can't fill theirs, because your tank's being filled from somewhere else. And so God gives you enough for yourself and to serve and love your spouse. And so that happens. It doesn't happen accidentally. It happens intentionally. By pursuing God, by going into that quiet room I'm so afraid of sometimes and waiting for God to speak to me, through my conscience or through his voice, however that looks. By going to church or, when I don't feel like it. The church thing is weird. I feel like the timeshare guy when I talk about going to church, because I profit from it. Like that kind of, I feel like people think that's like a commission thing, like I get a percentage of whatever. That's not how it works, but I feel like that's how people hear that. I don't care if you go to church. I care if you pursue a meaningful, life-giving relationship with your Father in heaven. Whether that's you here on a Sunday morning or home doing laundry or whatever. Just pursue God. Actually, you don't even have to pursue him. You've got to realize he's been pursuing you all along and allow him to pursue you. I'm sure there's people in the room right now that do not believe in God. And for whatever reason, mostly 90-something% of the time, someone that doesn't believe in God has just run into too many idiotic Christians. So you've decided you're not going to be one of those. But you haven't really weighed all the evidence or what you really believe about God. I don't need you to call yourself a Christian or get religious about this. I'm just saying, where does your identity come from? What is the source of your sustenance? If it's anything other than God, you do yourself a disservice. And if it's your spouse, you do your marriage a disservice, because no one is capable of living up to those expectations for a lifetime. And you aren't either, right? For them. And so we're talking about moving from worldly or secular models of marriage to a transcendent model of marriage, which is less about this and more about this, seeking God together. And even if you've made it a point to not be those Christians, I'm just saying be godly. Put God at the center of your relationship and your home. Now, that might look different for everybody. If you're a beginner in this regard, I recommend being intentional about it in this way. If you're not comfortable with praying like just randomly in bed at night, it's just a no-go. Like, that's just, let's keep the TV on until we're too tired to keep our eyes open anymore, and then let's turn it off and go to sleep. Like, that's, I get it. But when we're sitting over food, that can be a good place to start. Because at a minimum, even if you don't believe in God, you can stop and thank the universe for the food. Like, you should be thankful for food. We all are. And so you can stop and just for a moment together before you eat in the morning or in the evening, you stop, you give thanks together for the food and for each other. And suddenly, you've inserted into your life together something higher than the two of you. And I think that's the beginning of a really good thing.